If you drive into Pierce City, Missouri today, you will find a small town in the southwest corner of the state, down near the Kansas and Oklahoma lines, in the rolling hills of the Ozarks. About 1,200 people live there. It has a main street, churches, a city hall, railroad tracks running through the middle of it the way they have since the 1870s. And if you pull the census figures for Pierce City, you will find a number that should stop you, because it is not the kind of number that happens by accident. The black population of Pierce City is 0. Not small, not a few percent. 0. In a town that has existed since before the Civil War, in a state that was home to a large black population, a town that once had a black community woven into it from its earliest days, the number today is 0, and it has been 0 effectively for more than 120 years. Missouri in 1901 was a strange and dangerous place to be black, and the southwest corner of it especially. So, this was a former slave state that had stayed in the Union, a border state, a place where the racial order of the Deep South met the racial order of the frontier, and the two reinforced each other. The Ozark Hill Country, down near the Kansas and Oklahoma lines, was rural, poor, white, and increasingly hostile. A region where the black population was small, scattered, and as the new century opened, being actively pushed towards 0. Pierce City sat right in the middle of that, a railroad town that had grown up fast in the decades after the war, and the black families in it were an island in a sea that was turning against them. That did not happen slowly. It did not happen because people gradually drifted away for work. It happened in a single night, the night of August 19, 1901, when the white residents of Pierce City, joined by roughly 1,000 men who came in on the trains from the towns nearby, killed 3 black men, burned the black neighborhood to the ground, and drove every last black family out of town at gunpoint. By the next evening, the entire black population of Pierce City was gone. They came back once, briefly, under guard, to gather what furniture they could carry, and then they left on the train and never returned. This is the story of that night, and of the town that made itself white on purpose and has stayed that way ever since. To understand what was destroyed, you have to understand that the black community of Pierce City was not new, and it was not passing through. It was one of the oldest things in the town. It traced back to a woman named Godley. She had been brought into the area in 1848, enslaved along with her 5 children, the human property of a family named Jameson. That was before Pierce City existed as a town. When the railroad came through in the 1870s and the town grew up around the tracks, the Godleys and the families connected to them were already there. They had been there from the beginning. By 1901, there were around 30 black families in and around Pierce City, something on the order of 300 people, and they had lived alongside the white population for about 25 years in what one local historian, choosing his words carefully, called a period of peaceful coexistence. Remember the word Godley. It is going to run through this entire story because the family that had been the first black presence in the area would also, on one night, absorb the worst of what the town did. 25 years of coexistence. It is worth sitting with that, because it means the horror that came was not the product of strangers who had never lived together. These were neighbors. They knew each other's names. They had done business, shared a small town, buried their dead in the same ground for a quarter of a century, and all of it, the whole structure of 25 years, came apart in about 35 hours. It is worth trying to see that community as it actually was, because the erasure was so complete that it takes an effort of imagination now. These were not transient laborers. The Godleys and the families around them had put down roots across 2 generations. They owned homes. They worked, worshipped, raised children, and buried their dead in Pierce City. Godley's descendants had gone from being listed as somebody's property in 1848 to being property owners themselves in the same few square miles a half-century later, which is its own quiet, remarkable American story, the kind that almost never gets told because of how it ended. There was a black neighborhood, a black quarter with its own homes and its own church and its own preacher. There were around 30 households of people who, by every ordinary measure, belonged to the town as much as anyone in it, and the white town for 25 years had let them belong, or at least had not tried to remove them. That is the fragile, conditional thing that peaceful coexistence actually describes. Not equality, not safety, just an absence of the organized violence that could at any moment be summoned. The black families of Pierce City lived inside that absence the way black communities across the country lived inside it, knowing exactly how thin it was, and building lives anyway because there was nothing else to do but build lives. It began on a Sunday. On August 18, 1901, a young white woman named Gisela Wilde, 24 years old, left church and started home alone. She never made it. She was found murdered, assaulted, and killed in a culvert under the railroad tracks near Pierce City. The investigation, if it can be called that, lasted less than a day. There was no evidence pointing at anyone in particular, and in a town like Pierce City in 1901, the absence of evidence did not produce caution. It produced the opposite. As the local historian who has spent decades documenting this put it, the lack of evidence simply directed suspicion toward the black residents of the town. 2 black males were quickly taken into custody, a man named Will Godley, 32 years old, of the founding Godley family, and a 17-year-old named Gene Barrett, who had the terrible luck of having been seen downtown right around the time word of the murder spread. Think about how fast that is. A woman was murdered on a Sunday. By the standards of any real investigation, that is the moment the careful work begins. The questions, the evidence, the slow business of finding out what actually happened. In Pierce City, the opposite occurred. The speed itself was the tell. A real search for a killer takes time, and time was the one thing the town refused to spend, because time might have produced an answer the town did not want. It was far simpler and far faster to reach for the answer everyone already had ready. In a place like this, in this year, the machinery for blaming black men did not need to be built. It was already there, oiled and waiting, and it only had to be switched on. That was the entire case. A young woman was dead, no one knew who had done it, and the town had decided within hours who would answer for it. Over the next day and a half, the town worked itself into something that was no longer a town. Word traveled out along the rail lines to the surrounding communities, Monette and the others strung along the tracks, and the trains began to bring men in. Not to investigate, to participate. By the time it reached its peak, the crowd in downtown Pierce City numbered around 1,000 people, in a town of under 3,000, many of them armed, many of them strangers who had ridden in specifically for what was about to happen. This is one of the details that separates Pierce City from a simple act of mob violence, and it is worth holding on to. The mob was not just Pierce City, it was regional. Men got on trains to come kill their neighbors' neighbors. The violence was a kind of event, advertised by word of mouth along the railroad, drawing a crowd the way a spectacle draws a crowd. It is worth stopping on that image, because it is one of the most chilling things in the whole account, and it is easy to read past. Men bought tickets. They stood on platforms in Monette and the other towns strung along the line, and they waited for a train, and they rode it toward Pierce City, and the purpose of the trip was to be part of a mob. This was not a spontaneous eruption of local rage that got out of hand. It was, in its own grotesque way, organized, a thing you could travel to attend. The railroad that had built Pierce City, that had brought the town into existence in the 1870s and carried its goods and its people, now carried 1,000 men in to destroy a piece of it. The same tracks under which Gisela Wilde's body had been found became the delivery system for the mob that would answer her death. The mob went to the jail. They broke into the City Hall building where the 2 prisoners were held, and they dragged out Will Godley and young Gene Barrett, hands tied, ropes already around their necks. And here the 17-year-old Gene Barrett did something desperate and human. Faced with the rope, he shouted that he was not the killer, that another black resident had done it, and it worked. In the narrow sense that it saved his life that night. The mob pulled him back and he was hauled off to a jail in another town, Mount Vernon, out of their reach for the moment. That left Will Godley. The mob turned on him and demanded he confess. He would not. By the accounts that survive, including one from a descendant who read the first-hand newspaper reports a century later and said her arms went cold, Will Godley simply refused to speak. The crowd screamed at him to confess, and he gave them nothing. He stood there, resigned to what was coming, and denied them even the confession that would have let them tell themselves a story about justice. There is something in that refusal that the years have not worn down. Will Godley knew what the rope meant. He knew that a confession would not save him. The confessions extracted at lynchings almost never did, and he knew that his silence would not save him either. He had, in the last minutes of his life, exactly one thing left that the mob could not take without his cooperation, and that was the story they wanted. They wanted him to say he had done it, so that the 1,000 people who had come to kill him could go home believing they had done justice instead of murder, and he would not give it to them. He stood in front of a crowd screaming for his confession, and he denied them the one thing that would have let them sleep. It was the last free act available to a man about to be killed, and he used it. They hanged him from a telephone pole outside the city hall. It was 9 o'clock at night. If the night had ended there, it would already be a lynching, one of far too many in that era. But Pierce City did not end there, because the killing of Will Godley did not release the pressure in the crowd. It escalated it. After Will Godley was dead, the mob turned toward the black neighborhood itself, and now it was no longer about the murder of Gisela Wild, or about any individual suspect. It became about the black community as a whole, its existence in the town. Members of the mob went to the home of the Godley family. Inside were more members of that founding family, including French Godley, 70 years old, an old man related to Will, and another black man named Pete Hampton in his early 40s. The white men outside opened fire on the house. They poured bullets into it, and then they set it on fire. French Godley, 70 years old, and Pete Hampton died there, shot and burned, in a house the mob had turned into a killing ground. 2 more black-owned homes at least were set ablaze that same night. Some accounts put the number of burned houses higher. The black quarter of Pierce City was being deliberately destroyed, building by building, with its residents inside or fleeing into the dark. So the toll of the night was 3 men dead, Will Godley, French Godley, and Pete Hampton, and they were, as it happened, step-relatives, 3 men of the same extended family, the family that had been the first black presence in the whole area. Mark Twain, who wrote about Pierce City afterward in an essay called The United States of Lyncherdom, described the scene with the cold precision of a man who had run out of patience with his country. A young white woman found murdered, and a town's swift and total answer. That Mark Twain wrote about Pierce City at all is worth pausing on, because it tells you the killing was not a secret in its own time. This was national news. The most famous writer in America read about what happened in this small Missouri town, and was moved to set it down in an essay so bitter he called it the United States of Lyncherdom, an indictment not of one town but of a whole country that had made a spectacle of this kind of killing and called it justice. Twain understood something that the century of silence afterward would obscure, that Pierce City was not an aberration hidden in a backwater. It was America, doing in the open what America did, watched and reported, and then, in the way of these things, allowed to fade. And then came the part that makes Pierce City different from almost every other atrocity of its kind. Because the mob was not finished with 3 killings. It wanted the town. Through that night and into the next day, the message went out to every black resident of Pierce City, spoken and unspoken and enforced with bullets: leave and do not come back. As the local historian's account has it, the life of any black person, good, bad, or indifferent, was forfeit if they were found in Pierce City that night. A black preacher and members of his congregation fled into the countryside. Families ran into the woods in the dark with whatever they could carry. 30 families, 300 people, a community a quarter-century old, scattered out of the town under gunfire. Try to picture what that flight actually was. It was the middle of the night. The Black Quarter was burning or had just burned. 3 men of the community's founding family were dead, 1 hanging from a pole downtown, 2 shot and burned in their own house. And into that, the word came, carried on gunfire: get out. Not tomorrow, now. Families woke their children in the dark and ran, not down roads, where the mob was, but into the woods and the fields, carrying what they could grab, not knowing whether the men with guns were behind them. The preacher ran. His congregation ran. Old people and infants ran. 300 human beings who had done nothing, whose only offense was to be black in a town that had decided, that night, to stop tolerating their existence, scattered into the Missouri dark with the light of their own burning homes behind them. They had nowhere in particular to go. They only had to be gone. By the end of the following day, the entire black population of Pierce City, including the families who lived just outside the city limits, had gone. The next morning, some of them came back. Under the circumstances, it took a particular kind of courage to walk back into the town that had just murdered your relatives and burned your neighborhood, but they came back, briefly, escorted, to collect their furniture and their belongings. They gathered what they could. Picture that, too. To go back, even under escort, even in daylight, meant walking into the town that had just killed your relatives and burned your street, past the pole where Will Godley had hung the night before, past the neighbors who had done it or watched it done, to load a wagon with a bed and a table and whatever else could be saved. There would have been no illusion of safety in it. There was only the practical, heartbreaking arithmetic of poor people who could not afford to abandon everything they owned, weighed against a town that had made unmistakably clear it would kill them if they stayed. They took what they could carry and they left the rest, and they left the graves and they got on the train. And then the 300 or so black residents of Pierce City boarded the train, and they left the area, and they did not return. Gisela Wild's funeral, 2 days after the murder, reportedly drew more than 1,000 people. The 3 men the mob had killed, Will Godley, French Godley, Pete Hampton, were buried nearby in an unmarked potter's field, with no mourners present. No mourners, because the people who would have mourned them were gone, driven out of the county on pain of death, unable to stand at the graves. And here is a detail that arrived almost immediately, and that turns the whole thing from a tragedy into something closer to an obscenity. Within days of the lynching, doubts were already surfacing about whether the men had done anything at all. A newspaper item picked up and reprinted across the country noted that it was now believed Will Godley, the man who had refused to confess and been hanged for it, was not the real culprit. He had died denying it because he had nothing to confess. The town had killed him and driven out 300 people and burned a neighborhood over a crime the victims very likely had not committed, and the doubt was in the papers before the ashes were cold. There is a specific cruelty in the sequence of it. The town killed Will Godley because it was certain, or claimed to be certain, that he was guilty. His guilt was the justification for everything, the hanging, the burning, the expulsion of 300 people. And within days, that certainty had already begun to dissolve in the very newspapers that had reported the lynching, replaced by the quiet, appalling admission that they might have killed the wrong man. But by then it did not matter, because the point had never really been Will Godley. The murder of Gisela Wild was the spark and the excuse. What happened afterward, the burning of the quarter, the driving out of the community, the establishment of a town that would be white forever, had a logic of its own that did not depend on whether any particular black man had done any particular thing. The accusation was a door. Once it was open, the town walked through it towards something it may have wanted all along. Nothing was done. No one was punished. That too is part of the pattern. The killing of 3 men and the expulsion of an entire community happened in the open, in front of 1,000 witnesses, many of whom had ridden in by train to watch, and it produced no trials, no convictions, no consequences of any kind for anyone in the mob. What it produced instead was a template. Because Pierce City was not an isolated event, and this is the part that reaches beyond the one town. Historians who study the region have identified Pierce City as a turning point for the entire southwestern Missouri Ozarks. The moment that, as one of them put it, confirmed the acceptability of lynching and expulsion as a way of life. In the years around Pierce City, a wave of the same violence rolled through the region. There were lynchings in Monette, in Joplin, across the line in Pittsburgh, Kansas, in Springfield in 1906. Between the mid-1880s and about 1920, at least a dozen lynchings tore through this small region of the Ozarks, and the cumulative effect was not just terror, it was demographic. It was the deliberate, systematic removal of black people from an entire part of a state. Town after town in that rural region established what came to be called sundown rules, the unwritten, ferociously enforced law that no black person could be within the town limits after dark. There were no signs required, though some places had them. Everyone knew. Interviews conducted decades later confirmed that the unwritten law existed and was vigorously enforced. An entire region of Missouri made itself white and kept itself white, and Pierce City in 1901 was the event that showed everyone else it could be done. It is worth understanding how a sundown town actually kept itself that way, because it was not usually a matter of signs and laws, though those existed too. It was a matter of everyone knowing. The story of Pierce City did not need to be retold. It only needed to be remembered, and the memory did the work. A black traveler passing through the region after 1901 did not need to read a posted ordinance to understand that being caught in one of these towns after dark could be fatal. The knowledge traveled the way the mob had traveled, along the rail lines, by word of mouth, town to town, and it shaped where black families could live and work and even drive through for generations. An entire region of the map became, in effect, closed. Pierce City had not just emptied itself, It had helped teach a whole corner of a state how to stay empty. That is what makes the census number at the start of this story what it is. The 0 is not a statistical quirk. It is a monument. It is the visible, countable residue of a decision made on one August night and enforced for over a century. Now, remember Judah Godley, the enslaved woman brought into the area in 1848, whose descendants became the founding black community of Pierce City, and whose family name belonged to 2 of the 3 men killed that night. Her line did not vanish. The Godley descendants scattered the way the whole community scattered, and their history scattered with them so thoroughly that generations later, some of her descendants grew up not knowing this had happened at all. In recent years, one of them stood at a candlelight vigil in Pierce City and spoke about only recently learning this part of her own family's history. The town had erased the Godleys so completely that their own great-great-grandchildren had to rediscover that they had ever been there. That rediscovery is its own kind of measure of how thorough the erasure was. When a family loses its own history, when the great-great-grandchildren of a founding community have to be told by a stranger at a vigil that their people once lived and died and were driven from a specific town, something more than lives was destroyed. The expulsion did not just remove 300 people from Pierce City, it severed them from the place, and over the generations that followed, the place fell out of the family's own memory of itself, because there was no one left in Pierce City to keep it, and the survivors had every reason to look forward rather than back. A town can erase a people not only by driving them out, but by making itself so completely forgotten that the descendants no longer know there was anything to remember. The vigils are a recent thing. For most of the last century, Pierce City did what most towns did with a story like this, which was nothing. It let it sit unspoken, uncommemorated, a thing that had happened and then been folded quietly into the ordinary silence of a small American town. It was a local newspaperman in the nearby town of Monette, a reporter named Murray Bischoff, who spent decades digging the story back out of the record, tracking down the accounts, holding the anniversary vigils. Standing in the City Hall parking lot at 9 o'clock at night, the exact hour Will Godley was hanged, to say aloud what had happened on that spot. He is still, by his own account, looking for photographs, for artifacts, for the descendants of the people who were driven out, trying to put back together a history that a town spent 100 years not telling. The 3 men lie somewhere in that unmarked potter's field. The neighborhood they were dragged from is gone. The families who fled built their lives somewhere else, in other towns, in other states, in places that would let them stay after dark. And Pierce City is still there, on the railroad, in the Ozark Hills, 1,200 people, a main street, a city hall with a parking lot where a man was hanged from a pole for refusing to confess to a crime he probably did not commit. The trains still run through. The census still reads 0. They drove out every black resident in one night, in the summer of 1901, and it worked so completely that 120 years later the town they emptied has never filled back in. That is not the past failing to be remembered. That is the past still holding exactly the shape it was beaten into on the night of August 19th in Pierce City, Missouri.